So this recording focuses on qualitative sampling. So you will use qualitative sampling if your study is qualitative. So for example, if you're doing interviews, focus groups, you're using qualitative observations, this is the sampling material that you need to be thinking about. So what I'm going to do is just talk a bit about the logic of the qualitative sampling, but then give you some examples of some of the strategies you might use. So first of all, as you can see there from the slide, you actually have a very different logic compared to quantitative sampling. So in qualitative research, we often focus on a very small number of cases, which we look at very carefully and in depth. And you can even have cases in qualitative research where you only have one case that you look at. But normally I wouldn't recommend that. That might be something you do in case study research, but for most of you, you're likely to have a few more than one person involved in a study. On the other hand, if you've looked at the quantitative sampling slides, you will see that they are based on very large samples, where possibly randomly selected. That doesn't apply in qualitative sampling. And one thing to bear in mind that each qualitative project will be sampled differently. And actually, to a large extent, while there are strategies you can apply, you need to just carefully justify and explain what you have done. So I'm going to run through now some different types of sampling, qualitative sampling, that you'll come across in the textbooks. There are plenty of other kinds that will be mentioned. So this isn't a complete list by any means. So first of all, one of the ones you most commonly like to read about is something called theoretical sampling, which perhaps on the face of it sounds a bit difficult. And people often ask me sort of, well, what is the theory behind it? And there isn't really a theory as such. What theoretical sampling does, as it says there, is you select participants as your study needs evolve. So as you're going through a study, you begin to realise you might need to talk to certain kinds of people. And the reason why it's called theoretical sampling is we make these decisions as we begin to analyse our data and build theory as our project goes along. So in qualitative research, now a lot of students won't necessarily do this, but in a normal, qualitative research project, you might collect data and analyse it as you go along. And that's what I would encourage you all to do. And therefore you begin to build theory as you're collecting that data. So if you're doing a series of interviews, you might interview 2 or 3 people, begin to actually see what the data is telling you. You might begin to build some theoretical ideas from that data, and that also might help you decide who else you need to interview, and that you might need to interview certain people. So for example, in my PhD, I interviewed some local residents in Purbeck, a rural destination not far from Bournemouth, and I initially started interviewing people who were in sort of fairly senior positions, so people who were fairly senior in relation to tourism, and people who were local councillors. And then someone actually pointed out to me it would be quite useful to actually interview some disadvantaged local residents, so people from lower income groups, and in particular in my case people who had transport challenges, because I was interested in travel. And so I switched and actually sought out some participants who met that criteria. So as you can see there, the idea is you collect some data, you reflect on this data, you decide who else to involve in the study. And it's associated with Glaser and Strauss's grounded theory in particular. Then we have purposive sampling. This is also sometimes referred to as theoretical sampling, but typically here, and this is what I see a lot of students do, is they often make decisions at the start of the project rather than as in theoretical sampling where you make the decisions as you go along. And basically the logic behind this is actually just finding information-rich cases that meet the criteria of your study. And basically information-rich cases are those where we can learn a lot for our project. So you're looking for people who can tell you the information you need, and you might have various criteria, to identify these people. So you purposefully select certain people to take part in the study because they provide the information you need. Then we've got various variations on that. So one of these is extreme or deviant case sampling. So here we're looking for rich cases, so information-rich cases again, but they're unusual or special in some way. So what you're doing is you're selecting people who have, maybe particularly exemplify a characteristic of interest, or they've had an experience that makes them really stand out in some way. So, for example, if you're studying events and weather, so for example, outdoor events get affected by severe weather conditions, you might want to select participants who have experienced really severe weather at events, as opposed to just, a bit bad weather that day. And they might give you more insight in terms of how the event dealt with those conditions. Then we have maximum variation sampling. So in maximum variation sampling, we're actually going to deliberately select what we call their heterogeneous sample, so people who are very varied and different. So you're looking across, the scope of all the different kinds of people who could be involved. And it's typically a method used when we want to explore some abstract concept, and I've suggested the concept of trust there, where actually we just want to know sort of generally how do people feel about trust in this particular context. So for instance, it might be you're interested in people's online purchasing behaviour, say for an event, or making a booking online in tourism, and trust is quite important there. You might want to explore that with a maximum variation sample. And then we have homogeneous sampling, which is kind of the opposite of what I've talked about. And this is actually where you pick a small homogeneous sample where they have got a lot of very similar characteristics here. And here we might want to look at a particular subgroup in depth. I've got examples there, problems of single parent families in access to tourism. In sport, you might want to look at a group of people who take part in sport and have had a particular challenge in accessing that activity. So you're focusing in on quite a unique sometimes group of people, but they've certainly got a lot more shared characteristics than the maximum variation sample. Here's one that's very commonly used in a lot of student projects, which is snowball or chain sampling. And the idea here is you want to find people who know a lot about a topic, and you're not actually sure who to talk to. So you start off by finding one or two people who are information-rich informants, and actually through those people you ask for other people they know who might meet the criteria. So in my PhD, I found some people who were very knowledgeable about transport and tourism to talk to, and then actually from those got guidance on who else would be useful to talk to in that area. So what tends to happen is you do this as you go through the interview process. You set up an interview with your first, one or two participants, and then you ask them to guide you on who else to involve. And so the idea is a bit like making a snowball. You start with a small ball of snow, you roll it along, and it gets bigger and bigger. So you identify more and more people to take part. Now, eventually, one thing that happens at the end is it says the informants will typically diverge, because what tends to happen is as you interview more people, they tell you about people who they think would be useful to interview, and you've already interviewed them, depending on how big the topic is or how broad you're casting your net in terms of your participants. So eventually the chain sort of comes to an end. Then often we have opportunistic sampling. So this might happen particularly if you were doing more kind of participant observation type research. So you might, we had a PhD student a few years ago who did some research by attending music festivals, and she made a lot of on-the-spot field decisions about, what sampling and who to talk to. And you sometimes get these opportunities pop up where there's a good informant and you can undertake an interview there and then. So as I say, it sometimes happens when you're doing things like participant observation and you're engaged with people. So basically just take advantages of that. But it can also happen, you just come across someone when you're doing some research and you realise they're a good person to interview, and actually there's an opportunity just to get on with it. So it's very emergent, and it takes advantage of whatever unfolds as you're doing field work. In terms of who's a good informant, basically they have to have, the special detailed knowledge about your topic, and they're willing to talk about that, they're willing to communicate it. And also it can be helpful if they can, particularly if you're using a snowballing approach, they can smooth access to other possible respondents. In terms of sample size, unfortunately, there's no rules for this. As I say, it could be one individual in very particular studies, but I think that's very unlikely for a dissertation. So, a lot depends on, a whole series of questions here, like what you want to know. If your topic's casting quite a big net, you might need to interview quite a lot of people if you were doing interviews to actually kind of capture that information. What's at stake? Now, obviously, you'll be sampling for your dissertations, and you want to show that you've done a really good job here. So doing about 5 interviews is probably not going to be enough unless you've got a very hard to reach group of participants, in which case it might be. But, typically 15 might be good, but a lot depends on how challenging it is to actually get to those people you want to talk to. So it's something I would suggest you talk to supervisors about. Certainly if you want to publish qualitative research, very small samples can be problematic, and I've tended to find that less than 15 and, the journal article reviewers, do challenge it. But there's lots of debate about this in qualitative research, which I'm sure you'll read more about. And you've got to think about what will be useful. So some topics need you to look at quite a lot of people, to get a diverse range of views. In other cases, it might be quite a specific, unique group that you're looking at, and you don't need so many. So there's all sorts of issues out there about what will have credibility. But number 5 there, what can be done given the available time and resources? This is also pretty significant when you're doing a dissertation. You haven't got the cash to go and travel and do lots of interviews or, organise lots of focus groups. You haven't got that much time available. So that's a key thing. And then you will read about something called data saturation. So in qualitative research, we often use this idea as a point where we stop collecting more data. And it's the idea there when you're doing interviews, you're interviewing people and you realise that they're giving you no new information. So you've collected information from people and you've interviewed 2 or 3 people and you realise they've not said anything new. So you're beginning to get a saturation in terms of the data and your understanding of the topic. So just to draw a quick conclusion, basically qualitative sampling is mostly about choosing information-rich respondents who will meet the criteria of your study. Okay, and your sampling strategy is selected to fit the purpose of your inquiry, as well as the physical resources, in other words, the time and money that you have available to do this. What's very crucial in your dissertation is you describe and justify the sampling procedures and the decisions you've made as fully as possible, and be aware and outline the strengths and weaknesses of the approach. So be open and honest about any limitations there. And when you're actually presenting findings from qualitative research, be very careful not to overgeneralise from these purposeful samples. So you can't say your study is representative. So just be careful about that. It is, quite a selected group that you will have looked at. So now I'd recommend going to do some reading around doing qualitative interviews. Have a look at qualitative sampling. Have a look at some of the literature that I've recommended.